about why it's relevant. So today, the theme is all about Emerson and his alternative Trinity, which you just saw described: nature, humans, and the divine. And I want to invite you also, I'm going to have a discussion group that goes a little bit deeper, specifically on his essay, Nature. It's the last Tuesday of the month, November 30th at 7 to 8:30. It's on the calendars as a Zoom link for it, if you'd like to follow up and talk about it a bit more. And then next Sunday, it's a completely different story. So I'm doing the rest of the Thanksgiving story. So it goes back to our theological ancestors, the Pilgrims, and 200 years earlier. So Emerson was in 1800s, early 1800s, Pilgrims were early 1600s, and kind of how their theology was a little bit different. And you can see then how radically different transcendentalism was by the time we got to that point. So you caught everything in the video, right? I had to go through it like 6 times to write things down. So to me, there were 4 major themes in it that kind of strike me as part of Unitarian Universalism today. So the first one, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from the Reverend Dr. Daniel Cantor, he's the senior minister at First Unitarian Church of Dallas. When he does his orientation for new members, he said, "We are a paradigm shifting religion." And I think Emerson would have said the same thing, a paradigm shifting religion, because he starts out in the video saying he was very critical of the prevailing Christian thinking and practices at the time. And by the way, it didn't mention it, but he was a Unitarian minister, and that was a Unitarian church. And back then, the Unitarians very much were Christian. And so, in fact, they were more Calvinist at the time. And this was the Great Schism, where we moved away from being very Calvinist to being very liberal. And so he basically said that he thought organized religion just sucked the life out of religion and spirituality. And so I hate to be preaching this morning, but he kind of said, all you need to do is go out in the woods. You really don't need that building or getting together on Sunday morning. So he advocated separation from the commonly held religious beliefs. And then he, if anything, came out in his second essay, Self-Reliance, it's an emphasis on individual discernment and away from doctrine as a basis for belief. And that is very, very, very core in Unitarian Universalism today. So the second one, if you caught this, it was a little bit more subtle, but there are many sources that inform our faith, and they're always in flux. So many of the Christian denominations that we have in our areas would often say that it's all about the Bible. Bible is our source, it's closed, the canon was closed centuries and centuries ago, and that's what we use. And those of you that have been around for a while know that we have 6 sources, we label them, but they are actually clusters of sources. So we have probably 1,000 sources that we refer to. In fact, the children in religious exploration today and next Sunday are going to explore 2 of those. Today is the second one, and this is the child version of the saying. It's people of long ago and today whose lives remind us to be kind and fair. So it's basically all those heroes. I would put Gandhi in this space, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in this space. But today, the children are learning about Ralph Waldo Emerson and his best buddy, Henry David Thoreau, and Walden Pond, and why that's important to us today. Next week, they'll be talking about the 6th source, particularly when they're talking about Native American spirituality and honoring nature and the circle of life. And frankly, transcendentalism is what I've always nicknamed the first source. And here's the adult description of it. It is direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life, which to me is a very succinct description of what Emerson was just describing in his essay, Nature. So the point is, he was advocating, he was sort of the first universalist to say, I'm not sure that Christianity is everything. I think we should open up the world to much more ways of thinking and many more sources. So in this case, Our sister faith, the United Church of Christ, has a slogan that says the canon is not closed and that God is still speaking. And that's exactly what Emerson would say, that there's divine revelation constantly going on. And he would say the biggest source is probably in nature. And then, like he said, nature is in constant flux. So we are in constant flux with how divinity or higher ways of thinking are speaking to us. So the sources is number 2. Number 3 is the big one that I wanted to talk about today, this alternative Trinity. So when I say alternative, I'm talking about the classic Christian Trinity of God, Son, and the Holy Ghost. So the alternative is nature, humans, and divine. And I love his most famous quote was printed up on the screen. It's even in our hymnals. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me, and I am part of particle of God. In fact, he took a lot of grief for this because there was a little cartoonist at the time that did this giant eyeball on the head of this little stick man, and that was very well publicized. But needless to say, he really threw it out there, this whole idea that the divine is in everything, and we are definitely a part of that. And that was pretty radical thinking at the time. There were quotes in there that said, humans and nature being a unified singular whole. All of nature is an expression and permeation of one metaphysical essence of the universe of God, and that we are both the expression and the expressors of the singular oneness. So that is one of the biggest things that came out of that. But then if you think about where that leads you next is the 4th one. It's focused on individual human potential. Because if you go into a theology to say that everything is equal, all particle has a bit of the divine in it, that means all peoples have a bit of the divine in them. And so therefore, we should be focused on realizing our potential as much as possible. He encourages us to find our own path, to find our own interpretation, which is definitely what we're all about. And he encourages us not to disparage ourselves or our self-worth. And then if you saw in there, the narrator comes in, and it wasn't exactly what Emerson said, but his interpretation of it, there was a caveat that it's not always easy and always possible. Because we do have to remember that Emerson and Thoreau were very privileged in the society that they came from. So they had the wherewithal to build a cabin on Walden Pond and go live in the woods for a year. And by the way, that was on Emerson's property. So sometimes Thoreau would go have dinner with the Emersons. So it wasn't quite as rugged as we are led to believe. But what they're saying is that many people, because of a lack of privilege, cannot fulfill their potential. And we rarely meet our potential because we're held back by also systems and convention. So that's where Emerson and the Transcendentalists went into being also strong political activists at the time. They were strong abolitionists and advocates for women's rights, which were the 2 key issues in the mid-19th century. One thing you should understand, though, that Emerson and the Transcendentalists generally, by our standards, were a bit racist, because the prevailing theory at the time, and it was sold as being scientific, was the hierarchy of races, that whites were supreme and all other races were less than supreme, and it was sort of a hierarchy of how it went. And it was a theory that it was put out by the late 18th century, and by the 19th century, it was kind of taken as a truth. So there, by the way, Emerson was a co-founder of the Atlantic Monthly. And I read an article in there where he wrote an open letter to Lincoln at the beginning of the Civil War that we should go all out and emancipate the slaves. And his argument was, well, we are the superior culture, and so therefore we should do it on behalf of everybody else. So it was one of these arguments that by today's standards, we would cringe a little bit, But his point was that we should treat people fairly, and we should do everything we can for everyone to be able to realize their full potential. So that is really my summary of transcendentalism and what Emerson wrote and why it's important to Unitarian Universalism today. And I will let you know that Katina Danon has been, from the Green Bay Fellowship, has been toying with the idea of doing a whole sermon on transcendentalism and her experiences, and she's out in nature a lot and wants to share that. And she was waiting to see what I was going to talk about today to see if it will be redundant. So Katina, I don't think it's going to be redundant. And I think it's in January or February when she's going to do that. So stay tuned. So my objective number 2 was I want to give you an example of living into this theology. And frankly, it's really Emerson's strong influence on the environmental movement, which the 3 fellowships plus the Fox Valley Fellowship that I served, most of the members, the environmental movement is near and dear to the folks that belong. So I figured it would be fertile ground to talk about it. So what transcendentalism did is it created this appreciation and reverence for nature, and it was grounded in this theology. So Emerson and Thoreau are kind of viewed as the original founders of American environmentalism. Just the thinking shift of it, not that they did a lot like we did in the 20th century. But this was a long evolution. So think about it. You had European settlers coming over and kind of taking over and wiping out the indigenous people. And there's a lot written that said that there wasn't anybody living here at the time. It was just this unspoiled natural resource that God was providing the Europeans for commerce and for trade and to conquer and do what they wanted to with it. Well, transcendentalism flipped that on its head. It said that that isn't the way it is, that the nature that we're seeing is not just something we should be using, but it's part of us. We are part of it, and it is part of us. And therefore, our spirituality should be grounded in this nature. So that was a big flip in the mindset of America at the time. And so then an evolution came about from that. So in the beginning was preservation. There was all the moves to save the wilderness, to preserve it, to revere it. And think of when all the national parks came about at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Well, then preserving it moved to the environmental movement, particularly if you think of the late 60s and early 70s. Earth Day is when it's marked, April 22nd, 1970, where it went to, wait a minute, we're doing a lot of bad things to it. We need to now protect it and restore it. And so I know many of us are very active in at least a small way in trying to do that. You know, trying to use less energy, be more efficient, recycle, all kinds of things. And then it leads eventually to environmental justice. And so the term environmental racism grew out of grassroots activism in the early 1980s. And they were talking about how, if you look through time, most of the bad things that happened by degrading the environment hit people of color and poor people more directly than the privileged people. And so then it got into environmental racism and the idea of environmental justice. So what does this have to do with Emerson? In my mind, Emerson, if he were alive today, would be, and I've coined the term justice environmentalist because it just worked better. That he very much, of course, revered nature. He would have been very sad that it was being destroyed at an unprecedented rate and be very much an environmentalist. But in the same way that he was an abolitionist and he was all for women's rights, he would be alive today talking about how we need to make sure that people that are feeling the impact of environmental degradation have the ability to realize their potential. And they can't, like Flint in the water system and the lead in the water system. That's an example of it. So I thought this was an important issue and a distinction in our theology because of a real life example that happened over the last few years. And I'm kind of speaking to the Open Circle congregation here because this is a story about what happened to them. So I don't know the exact date. I'm sorry, I didn't look it up, but the Unitarian Universalist Association came up with the distinction of being a green sanctuary. And I know this has been around at least since the 90s because I was involved with it tangentially at the Fox Valley Fellowship. And what the green sanctuary meant was that you had a focus on environmentalism, that you'd probably done an energy audit of your building and you decided what ways you could make it more efficient, like replacing light bulbs or adding insulation or replacing windows or something like that. And you also did education activities. So you helped the congregation understand why this was important and what they could do in their own lives to make a difference. And there was a whole checklist of things you had to do. And if you did all of those things and proved that you did them, you could apply and get this green sanctuary status, which Open Circle did. And they're very proud of it, and rightly so. And one of the big things they did is they have this nice flat roof and there's no shade anywhere around it and it kind of faces south. And so they did a capital campaign and put solar on the roof. And so it's been there for quite a while now and it generates a lot of the electricity that the building uses. In fact, I was told during COVID, since we hardly used the building, we were actually earning money instead of having to pay out money. Well, then I don't remember how long it was, and Jeannie's probably watching and she could probably tell me, she's probably yelling through the screen right now, but we had to renew. And so they filled out the application and talked about what we've done since then. And the application, well, it wasn't denied, but they wanted us to work more on it. And this was where the shift happened. So the Unitarian Universalist Association went from a focus on environmentalism to environmental justice. And here's the rationale, whether it's fair or not. The rationale was people of relative privilege, probably white people of relative privilege, can probably relatively easy raise the money to put solar on their roof. And even though they're probably very charitable and do a lot of things in the community, which the Open Circle congregation does, what the UUA now wanted was more of a partnership with particularly people of color or disadvantaged people in general that focused on energy. So, and we were stumped to come up with a project. And so we're still mulling this over. In fact, we've walked away from it right now because we haven't been able to solve it. But it would be something about, think of this, if we're putting solar on the roof of our fellowship, perhaps we could have also raised the money to put solar on one of the historically Black churches in Fond du Lac, or the Latino or Hmong Community Center, or something like that. So it's sort of but then that gets into this space where we're telling them what they need. So the whole idea was to partner with another group and say, well, we need to focus on energy and we have the capability to help. What do you think would be in your best interest? Well, the end of the story is now the congregation is very involved in putting solar panels now on the public library. And the public library, although it's not designated as distinctly an institution for people of color, public libraries today are often places where homeless people, poorer people tend to hang out because it keeps them warm in the wintertime, and it is open to everybody, people of color and otherwise. So I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe now we've got an opportunity to rethink that. So that's just one example, and I think we all could think about this in discernment in our own lives. You know, I'm a big recycler, I drive a Prius, I do all those things white liberal people do in the Upper Midwest, right? But I'm not sure that I've ever thought about using my relative privilege in the societies where I am to stand up for people of color or people who don't have the same loud voice that I have to try to make a difference in their lives. So that's how, to me, I wrap it all together from transcendentalism and Emerson and Thoreau, the beginning of environmentalism, and how we bring it to where we are today. So I think what I want to leave with you is ask you for some discernment. ponder that question. How can we live up to the spirit of Emerson and Thoreau in this space? And then I hope and pray that the spirit of the universal being will be with us all in that discernment. Amen.